Hi, everyone. This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our Facebook group and our YouTube channel and our newsletter and our great sponsors, Abitativa Casa, Italy Rooting, and Phil Italy. And my guest today is Tom DeSimone. So welcome, Tom. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Bob. I appreciate you having me.
No, glad to have you. Glad to have you. I know you had messaged me, I guess, a while ago on Facebook and said you had a lot of stories. So we'll get into those stories for sure.
Okay, sounds good.
To start, where's your family from in Italy?
Okay, so my father's family's from Naples. And it's funny, Bob, on one of your podcasts you'd mentioned that you had family that lived like right on the side of Mount Vesuvius. And I remember as a child, my grandmother showing me pictures of her cousins that lived on the side of Mount Vesuvius. So I thought that was pretty funny when you mentioned that on one of your podcasts. So yeah, my dad's family is from Naples. They're from Castel Nuovo di Napoli. So both of my father's parents and both my father's grandparents came from there. My mother's side is a little bit more interesting. Her grandfather's from Marsala in Sicily. Her other grandfather is from San Giovanni in Sicily. And then her mother's mother, we're not really exactly sure where she's from in Sicily because she came over here alone. She was like 16 and her parents were already here. You know, my grandmother never really asked her too much about where she came from. So I've done some research and I have some ideas, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay. And then my mother's paternal grandmother's actually from Abruzzo. And my mother always thought she was Sicilian too. And I started doing research and I'm like, no, she's not Sicilian. She's from by Campobasso is where her father's family's from. So, and I've actually been able to trace her line like back to the 1600s because they all lived in the same village for like 300 years. So that's pretty much where everybody's from.
That's incredible that they the same village for 300, and they probably never left the village for 300 years either.
They probably didn't because I kept doing research and a lot of help from the church and using ancestry. I had some some DNA matches, and the funny thing is that there was a guy that we lived in the same town. We grew up in the same town, never knew we were related. And it turned out we had like the same fifth great grandfather. After doing research, it was just the funniest thing. But they just stayed in the same village and they just, I guess they never left. Like you said, they were just, they were born there and they died there. So I guess, they were simple farmers, most of them. So I guess, they're probably happy for the most part.
I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were. And, it's funny is you say that because one of my best friends from college, he's from Sicily and he's my wife's fifth cousin, and we would have no idea, unless we did the DNA, we never would have figured that out.
Right. And it's funny because once I started doing a lot of research, I found out like you go back like 3 or 4 or 5 generations and kind of people met up again. So it's like they're kind of, interrelated and sometimes, 150 years apart. You know what I'm saying? So I guess when you live in the same village, there's probably not a whole lot of choice on who you're going to marry. And everybody has like 10 kids and,
Well, yeah, exactly. And some of those villages, I mean, there were maybe, 5, 6, 7 families, in that village.
Right. So, I've done I've done a lot of research. So I found out on my family tree, my family name that comes up the most is Patron. I don't know anybody by the name of Patron, but going back like 4 generations, there were so many Patrons. I have like over 60 Patrons in my family tree. And that's not even counting some of the ones as I'm going down, down further generations, trying to find some of my matches, that are still alive now. So, it's just funny that, I had no idea I had any relatives named Patron until I started doing research. Now, I'm finding out like I had a lot of them. So, yeah, I mean, the whole research thing, I find it fascinating. To me, it's like a hobby. So I'm always, trying to, figure out, I get new matches all the time on place like Ancestry. So trying to figure out, oh, how am I related to this person? Or, and sometimes you're going back so many generations, it takes a while to figure it out. So,
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned earlier that you got a lot of help from the church. That's nice because, I've heard the church is either you find the priest that wants to give you the information, or you find one that just doesn't. They lock you out. They don't want to be bothered.
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I haven't really any problems with that, or at least really the only place I've looked is in Abruzzo, where I got a lot of church information, simply because I had a lot of backup information that probably helped. So I kind of knew what I was looking for. Like I was able to ask like some really specific questions. And I think that's what they look for. They're looking for like, you can't just send them an email and say, oh, I'm looking for, like my great grandfather, Raphael DeSimone. I can't just, and they're going to come back and say, well, there were 20 Raphael DeSimones,
All born within 3 years of each other,
Right,
probably.
exactly. And that's the other thing that's confusing, Bob, is like, and I don't know about your family, but my family, like, they name everybody after a grandfather, right? So it's either the father's father, and the first child's the father's father, and then the second child's the mother's father. So like, my great grandfather, my father's mother's father, his name was Pietro. I have like five cousin Peters, and some of them have the same last name. So it's like it gets so confusing. And like on my mother's side, my mother's maiden name is Jenna, and so her great grandfather was Giuseppe Jenna, and there's probably like 5 or 6 Joseph Jennas. And they're all cousins. It's because we have to name, and we're naming after the grandfather. But I'll tell you a funny story. My grandfather's name is Thomas, just like myself. His grandfather's name was Pasquale. And apparently when he was born and they decided to name him Thomas, not Pasquale, he had a fit. Like he was not happy. So they decided to call my grandfather Pasquale or Pat. So the whole time I knew my grandfather, the whole time he was alive, I never heard anybody call him Tom or Thomas. He was always Pasquale or Pat. Like they never called him by his first name. Like even my grandmother never called him by his name. So and I always wondered, like, and it wasn't even his middle name. They didn't even Pasquale wasn't his middle name, but they always called him Pat. So I never heard them call him Thomas or Tom.
No, that's funny. I was watching this old interview with, and it just popped up on YouTube with Joan Rivers and Frank Zappa, and she was asking him about his kids' names. He gave them the weird names, and
Right.
he said, well, growing up in an Italian family, he said there were Frank Zappas everywhere. He said, so I was Frankie Boy because they had to distinguish somehow, right?
Right.
which Frank they were talking to.
Right. Yeah, I mean, people have nicknames or whatever. Like they call me Tommy, and they call, another cousin a different name or whatever. Like, everybody, or by a middle name. Sometimes it was a middle name. It was like my father. His name was Ralph, but nobody ever called him Ralph. They called him, his middle name was Robert, so they always called him Bob. Like he grew up as Bob.
That's funny. Yeah,
So
that's funny.
and
So
it gets
so
confusing.
Yeah, I know. So when did the families arrive in America?
Okay. My mother's grandfather, his name was Salvador Traina. He came here. He was only 3 years old. He was the first one over in 1898. So he came over with his parents. He had 2 older sisters. They came to New York and they lived in Elizabeth and Jersey City. They moved around a little bit when they first got here. And then Her other grandfather, his name was Rocco Jenna. He came from Marsala. He came here. He's like in 1913, he was 12 years old, and he came here with his parents and a younger brother. And actually, when my mother was a child, her family, they all lived in the same house. And then when I was born, we all lived in the same house. I actually lived with my great grandparents when I was little. So my her one grandmother was actually born here, the one that came from Abruzzo. She was born in Jersey City. And her other grandmother, her name was Lena Pranio. Actually, her name was Charlotte. She was born in 1903, I believe, and somewhere in Sicily. She came over here in 1919, met up with her parents, and they lived in Jersey City. On my father's side, my great-grandfather came over here a few times because he kept going back and forth. I think the first time he came over here was like 1906, but he didn't come over here permanently till like 1912. So my grandfather was born here. He has two older sisters that were born in Italy. And then my grandmother's family came over here right around the same time, around 1914, 1915.
So that's unusual for your grandfather to go back and forth between 1906 and 1912. Do you have any idea why?
Yeah, he was actually importing. He actually had a business where he's importing wine. So I guess he was coming over here and making some sort of like deals, like trying to, sell, whatever the wine to whoever would, was buying it here. I mean, I don't know how things worked back then. From what I understand, that's what he was doing when he first got here. I also understand that he was still doing that during Prohibition, but
I was going to say that.
at least that's what my grandfather had always told us.
They used to dump it off the Jersey Shore. They load it off the boats.
Well, my grandfather told me when he was a kid that there were a few times he was going out in the ocean on a boat with his father to meet other boats out in the ocean. So, yeah. So that's what my understanding why he came back and forth. But pretty much the rest of them, they came here and stayed. I can tell you an interesting story. So my great-grandmother, my father's grandmother, she came over here, like I said, around 1915. Well, back in the 70s, they all wanted to go to Italy on a trip. Well, she didn't have a passport. She was like not even a U.S. citizen after being here for 50 years. So she actually, at 81 years old, became a U.S. citizen so she can get a passport to go back to Italy.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's something. That's something.
And a bunch of them went back to Italy. Like, my grandmother's been there went there a couple of times. She passed away about 10 years ago now, my grandmother. But a bunch of them went back there for a few months. And I think that was the only time she ever went back. Her and her sister were the only ones that came over. She had other family. I think she has two sisters and a brother that lived, in Italy. They both went back. But I can tell you something interesting. My grandfather's sister was born in Italy. She came over here as a child. She went back to Italy and got married. And then they both came back here to both came back to New Jersey. So she actually went to Italy to find a husband. I don't know if exactly, why, if it was somebody that she knew or somebody the family knew.
It may have been arranged. Who knows?
It may have been arranged. I don't know. I know that my great grandparents on my mother's side, her father's parents, that was an arranged marriage. But I don't know about about my grandfather's sister.
So now, have you been back? Have you gone back?
Yes, I have. I want to go back. I'm hoping to go back next year. I was there 2 years ago. My wife and I went over there. And I could tell you one thing. I don't know if you've ever been to Naples, but it's interesting crossing the street in Naples.
Oh, yeah.
My wife was like scared to death. She's like, the cars aren't stopping. I'm like, we just run across and everybody else runs.
Well, when we were there, the first time I was there was like just about 30 years ago now. But we only took the train from Rome to there, and I grabbed the car across from the train station, and then we drove down to Sorrento. I won't drive there anymore. My driving days are over. But the last time we went 3 years ago, we were with people from Naples, and they were just like, you just say, come, and then we had to revive our New York senses, Yeah. But my wife was still, I said, you grew up in Manhattan. How are you afraid to cross the street in Naples?
Right, right. And my wife worked in Manhattan for years, so it's like, come on, it's not as bad as Manhattan, I don't think. I don't know.
No, I don't think so either. But the scooters used to freak her out, and I said, "Don't move." I said, "They'll go around. Don't try to move. They'll find their way around you." So
Right.
after I convinced her of that, because they come down those alleyways and just
Right.
shoot
Yeah,
her out.
exactly. Exactly. And there's so many, that's the one thing. There's so many like little alleyways and you know,
Did you say that we stayed? My wife wasn't thrilled with me. We stayed because I wanted to be where the action was. So we stayed in the old part, the historic center, not maybe three blocks from the Duomo or something like that. Did you stay there, or you stayed in the different part of Naples?
actually I didn't stay in Naples at all. So we visited there, but we didn't stay at all. The last time I was there, I actually went on a cruise when I went with my wife came. We were on a cruise and we did a cruise around Italy. So we got off, it was something she wanted to do. I really wanted to take the more immersive.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so we were in Rome. We were in trying to think where else we went. We didn't get to Florence. We went to Pisa. We went to Lucca. We went to Rome. We were there in Rome. We went to the Colosseum. We went to the Vatican. We went to Pompeii. I'm trying to think where else we went. I know we went one other place. I can't remember now.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah, we had always gone south until this last trip in May, where we went north, and we spent 4 days in Milan and 4 days in Bologna and 5 days in Florence, and then we did kind of like side trips. But Florence, I really like. People had told us before we went. Some people had said that it was dirty there, and so, but I found it very nice there in Florence.
Right. And my sister was there and she liked it too, because I've had some other people tell me, "Oh, Florence is like the Detroit of Italy." And
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, that was the way it was described to me. But my sister was just there. When was she there? Not too long ago, maybe, I don't know, within the last few months. And she really liked, actually, she came back and said, I want to move there. Like, that was, she really loved Tuscany and she liked that area. But the trip we're planning, we want to start in Rome, spend a few days there, then go down to Naples, spend a few days there, and then take a train up to Florence, spend a few days there, and then go up to like Milan and Lake Como. We really like to see Lake Como, um, and then I said I'd probably like to rent a car for a couple of days and drive out to like Montagano, where my great grandmother's family came from, and just check out that area. I heard that the Abruzzo and Molise are beautiful. So
Yeah, yeah. We've been to part one of my ancestors way back. They were from Capricotta and Molise, and it's really nice in the mountains up there. And we spent our last night in a town on Lake Como, but not in Lake Como, not in Como itself. It was across the lake, a little town called Bolano, which was very nice because it there weren't a lot of tourists there, and you could get a water taxi to go across to the lake.
right.
And it was quiet. It was very nice. They had this waterfall thing that you could walk up to and all of that. It was really, really a nice place. And then we went to a couple of towns that Americans wouldn't go to, Modena and Ferrara. And I wanted to go. My daughter wanted to go to Modena because that's where the Ferrari car museum is, and she
Oh,
loves
okay.
cars. And it was a pretty neat experience. And then in Modena, I had the ancient relatives from there. But both of those were nice little quiet towns outside of all the touristy nonsense. It was a nice day, nice place to spend the day, and it was only like a half hour train ride from Florence, so it was nice. So when you were doing doing your research, did you come across anything that like really surprised you about an ancestor, or whether it was a job or something that shocked you?
Yeah, a few things. Well, one thing was, so my mother's grandmother, uh, the one that was from Abruzzo, her family was Abruzzo. She was born here. Her parents she was one of the youngest of like 8 or 9 children. And so she wasn't actually raised by her parents. She was raised by her father's sister. So my mother, growing up, knew, this aunt and uncle of my, my great grandmother, because that's who raised her. Like they were her, like to her, they were her parents. Like his name was Frank, and my uncle's name is Frank. They named my uncle after, her uncle, because that to her they were like her parents. Her father was, we don't really know what happened to him. She told the story, years ago, that what she remembers of her father is that her father, he ended up passing away when she was young, and her mother lived in New York. But the funny thing was that, so my mom asked me to do some research on the aunt and uncle because she really wasn't sure exactly where they were from. And it wasn't too difficult to find where they were from because I figured they were probably from where, my great grandmother's father was from. And I was able to find all the information. So I'm doing some research and I noticed that both of their mothers had the same last name. So now I'm doing more research. I find out that they're first cousins. So they never had any children, but they were first cousins. And my mom was completely shocked. She never had any idea. She thought she was just related to the aunt because it was, her. But her grandmother never said that, the uncle was actually, she was related to the uncle too. Her grandmother never told them. I don't know if her grandmother didn't know. Maybe she didn't know. I don't know. But my mom was in complete shock when I told her that. She's like, really? I'm like, no, their mothers were sisters. So that's interesting. In terms of jobs, most of them were farmers, Most of them are farmers, simple people. Believe me, I don't have anybody that's famous or anybody that was royalty or anybody like that in my family that I could find. But, a couple other things that are interesting is like, going back to that same, great grandmother, her father's name was Giuseppe. And it turned out he had 2 brothers named Giuseppe, who had passed away before he was born. So, I guess the parents named one son Giuseppe, that son passed away. Named the second son Giuseppe, that one passed away, and he was the third Giuseppe. And we were like, I guess they really wanted that name bad,
Well, it was back to the whole grandfather thing again. My mom's uncle Dominic, there were 4 before him.
Really?
4 sons named Dominic. They all passed away. He was the only one who survived.
Right, and that's the same thing here. And you go and you're looking on, researching like my mother's other grandmother. There were a bunch of children in that family, and she was the only daughter that survived. Like, every other, for whatever reason, every other daughter, died within the first year. Like it's the 1800s, it's, who knows if they even had doctors in these places, I don't know what they did back then.
Yeah, in those small mountain towns and stuff like that.
Right.
Who knows it? Sometimes I think about it's amazing anybody survived.
Yeah, right, exactly. Because, just the diseases, and I guess back then you get an infection and,
That was it.
That was it. It's like, it's sad because you read through and like, going through the records, like, I find, a father or a mother, whatever, they wrote something down. It's, the child was 6 months old and passed away. And, you just find all kinds of stuff like that. Like, it's sad. It's,
It is.
You just wonder, I don't know. I don't want to, you can't say like they got used to it, but I guess it was almost in some ways, if you had 10 kids and 7 or 8 survived to be adults, that was probably a good thing back then.
Yeah. Yeah. My grandmother, my mother's mother, she had 11 and 2 died young.
Right.
So, and the rest of them survived. But, my wife's mother had a twin sister. She stepped on a nail on Coney Island and died when she was 14 from infection. So
Oh,
that was
yeah,
here,
yeah,
probably
you can get,
19, I guess around 1935 or something like that.
right,
So
you can
even
get
here it
tetanus.
was.
Right. Yeah, it was a little, maybe a little bit better, but who knows, I'm sure it wasn't that much better in the 1800s.
No, it must have been, it had to be rough. I was saying the other day to somebody, even in Matera and Basilicata, they were living in caves up until the 1960s.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, we went there and there was it was like a 2-room cave, if you will, if you could picture it. And one room was for the animals and the other room was for the people.
Wow.
And it was only the president of Italy at the time went there and saw the conditions, and he had the government build some housing and move people out and stuff like that. They don't live in caves anymore, but they're still, I mean, when you go down into the valley at Matera, there's still, these stone houses and everything that people, I'm sure they probably have Wi-Fi now.
Yeah, they probably do. They probably have everything now.
I know they have cars because I saw them down there.
And what's interesting too, Bob, is that, when I was a kid, and I don't know how it was in your family, but my grandfather was so against, he didn't want us learning Italian. And, I'd go into my grandparents' house, they all spoke Italian. And, and I wanted to learn language. My grandfather was, no, you're American. You learn English. You don't need to know Italian. And, I mean, he was born here and he went there a few times, but the only reason why he went to Italy was he was a merchant marine. And so he went to Italy whenever the ship took him to Italy. Later in life, when my grandmother went back, she went back twice to Italy. My grandfather did not want to go, had no interest in going. And so I asked him, I said, Grandpa, why don't you want to go? And he said, well, he goes, my parents left there. He goes, and they left there for a reason. And I said, what's the reason? He goes, because they just didn't, because the people they were so poor and they weren't treated well. And, and they just felt coming here was a better opportunity. And that's why they came over here. I almost sensed there was maybe, I don't know if his father had any sort of bitterness or I don't know, but that's what I kind of sensed, that the people left because they had no opportunity there. So.
Yeah. I wish they had. I mean, I'm trying again. I'm trying to learn again. The Italian club, we have lessons. I'm getting a little bit better, but I wish they had taught us, and some of the other ethnic groups like the Polish, they would teach their kids
Right.
Polish. They had Polish schools, and the Jewish, of course, had Hebrew schools. And we didn't have that. But I know what you're saying. I never. It's not that my grandparents. Well, my grandparents were kind of older because my parents are on the younger part of the family.
Right.
I just wish, because I spent so much time with my mother's mother. I used to play cards with her, Italian cards and all of that kind of stuff. And I never, of course, I was a kid, but I never thought to ask her about what life was like growing up in Italy. And because they lived on farm, they were farmers.
Right.
And I kick myself now for not asking those questions.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like I sit here and I wish I would have asked more questions. My great grandmother, my father's grandmother, the one who became a citizen when she was like 81 years old, she never had any education. Like she had, when I say zero education, I mean, she never learned how to read and write. So my mother, for a birthday, used to get Italian, used to go crazy trying to find Italian birthday cards, right? Not knowing that she didn't even know how to read, thinking, I'm going to get her Italian. She didn't know how to read or write Italian. She didn't know how to, she couldn't read and write in English. So my mother thought maybe she could read and write Italian. She didn't know how to read and write in Italian either.
Yeah. My mother's mom, neither. She didn't know how to read or write.
Yeah.
I have the documents from her alien identification card has an X, and my
Yes.
aunt signed underneath it.
Yes. I've seen a few of those in my family where, right, it said Mark left by, and they was just put an X. I mean, even like my grandparents here, like my grandfather, he only went to school to 6th grade. That was it. He went in with working.
I don't know if you heard the interview. It's a fascinating interview. The one I did with Dr. Inyaro. His family came. I think he's 83, so about 10 years older than I am. And I want to say his family came in the 50s or something like that. He was a young boy when they came. And they spoke only Italian and had zero education. Neither his mother or his father. Went to one day of school in Italy. And he won the Nobel Prize in, I don't know if it was medicine or physics. In 1998, he won the Nobel Prize. So it just goes to show you the people, they weren't stupid, they were smart people. Just there was no reason for them to probably get education in Italy because you're going to work the farm.
Right. Right. Exactly. You're out there, milking a cow or, or whatever, getting olives off the olive tree,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that was their resistance. But I just found it so fascinating. And he said, I said, well, how did you? He says, I was just very inquisitive. I used to ask my mother and father all of these questions about, not necessarily, but like, why is the sky blue, or why does this happen, and why does that happen? And he said his father wanted him to become a pharmacist, but instead he went into not the handing out of pharmaceuticals, but actually like, investigating how to create them and stuff like that. It's just a fascinating story and such a really great guy. And it was funny because I didn't realize until I was reviewing his notes before the interview that he had won the Nobel Prize. And I'm like, oh my goodness.
Wow.
How did I ever get this happen? Why am I interviewing a guy who won a Nobel Prize?
I don't know anybody that's won a Nobel Prize. I can tell you that. There's none in my family, as far as I know.
Yeah. Well, it was just a complete thing. But that's why I love doing this, because he was so down to earth and had a great story about growing up in Brooklyn and all of that kind of stuff. And then he was started out in Brooklyn, and then they wound up in Long Island. I guess you grew up in Jersey then, yeah?
I grew up in Jersey. I was born in Union, and like I said, we lived with my mother's grandparents for a while. They lived in Clark, and then I grew up in Bricktown, down the shore. I've been here in Florida now for we moved down here like 2008. I guess it was 2000. Yeah, it was 2008 we moved down here. So when I moved down here, my grandmother was still here, my mother's mother.
How old was she? She must have.
She passed away about 6 years ago. She was 93.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, my other grandmother was 97, my father's mother.
Wow.
Yeah, and all the women in my father's, all my father's like aunts were all like 80s and 90s. They were all old. And my grandmother's mother was 93 when she passed away. I knew her real well when I was a kid. Yeah, my grandmother was funny. She was this funny lady, always telling jokes, really funny lady. Would tell you what she thought. She would tell you, like, she never
sounds like my Aunt Mary.
Yeah, just if that's what she thought. She wasn't hiding how she felt or what she thought.
Just like my aunt.
Yeah.
My aunt used to call I guess it was the late 60s, early 70s, when the girls were starting to wear, I guess, halter tops and short skirts. And she used to call them trampolines.
That's good.
And it's funny. You probably had the same thing. With the weddings, they used to give the envelope with the money and all of that stuff. So I remember growing up and hearing they used to say because Aunt Mary used to hold the boost, right? She was the one with the bag, and she would collect all the things. And I used to think she used to say booster, and I thought it was like a boost, like to help you up.
Right.
I only learned, I don't know, when I was doing the Italian lessons online or something. Busta means envelope.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
I had no idea.
I didn't know that either.
And they used to say, my aunt, especially my Aunt Mary, used to say that if something was expensive, she used to say it was dear, right? She used to say that, and I found out later that in Italian they would say caro, which is dear, so it was kind of like a similar kind of thing. But yeah, some of those words growing up, I was like, that's what they were saying. Because I only heard Italian when they didn't want us to know something in my house with my mother and father.
Yeah.
And of course you learned all the curse words growing up because those were prevalent. But yeah, they used to that if my parents didn't want us to know something, they would. Not a lot, but they would say something. They would talk in Italian, and they would fight over whose Italian was proper, which in essence, neither one of them, because my father was from Naples, my mother was from Bari, and the dialects, were different.
Right.
And of course, the American would filter in there too. The English would filter in too.
Right. It's interesting because, like I said, live with my great grandparents now. My great grandmother was born here, so she knew English, but she was raised by, in an Italian speaking house, so she spoke Italian, and then she married a man who was Sicilian, but they used to speak to each other in Italian all the time. So I don't know if dialect was an issue, because Sicilian. I mean, I don't really know exactly what my great grandfather spoke, if it was a Sicilian or if it was an Italian dialect, or I don't know, but they were able to communicate in Italian. So
yeah, and they probably caught on. I mean, I've talked to some people even to today. I mean, in fact, my Italian teacher said that even today, between the North and the South, they say things differently.
They do.
Like again, in the Barres, they chop off all the vowels off the end of everything. So we never said things like ricotta, or they said regot.
Right. That's my family too, regot.
Yeah,
right.
But if you really speaking proper Italian, they would say ricotta.
Right.
The two. That's I think the most difficult thing learning Italian for me was two things. One is if you have double consonants, you have to pronounce them both.
Right.
Right. And the other thing is you pronounce every vowel. So if there's like an I and an E together, like you have to pronounce the I and the E, So like again, like your name would be DeSimone in Italian, right?
Exactly, because when we were in I'm trying to remember if it was when we went to Rome, we went on a tour, and the guy saw my name and he's like, DeSimone, like he was.
Well, my name, I'm embarrassed when I'm there because if somebody asks me my name, I say Sorrentino, which is not how they say it. They say Sorrentino.
Oh, okay.
Sounds a lot nicer than the way we say it, because again, they roll the R's and they pronounce they pronounce the O different and things like that. So I'm always embarrassed to say my own name in Italy.
Yeah, and I mean, and this is what I've said to, like, what I say. I just say, we're American.
Right.
We,
Yeah.
we're of Italian descent, but we're Americans. We're not,
Of course. Yeah.
We're not really Italians. And my son was a few years ago was like pushing. He goes, "Oh, why don't you look into seeing if you get your Italian citizenship?" And I was like, wasn't something I was really interested in. And I said to him one day, I said, I wonder if what my grandparents would think, because they fought so hard to be American, like they were, I mean, I heard the stories when they were younger, and they were just, the bias against them, and,
Yeah.
and all, they fought so hard to be American and learn the language, and, and try to speak, especially like my great grandfather came from Marsala. He spoke with a heavy, he spoke broken English, but he learned the language. He was a tailor. He had a business. He had, hundreds of clients. He had a very good business. And it's funny, he worked to the day he died. That man literally worked to the day he died. They didn't understand retirement. It's like they just keep working.
Well, yeah. No, there's that. They had that drive, to do stuff. So before we go, because I know
Sure.
you've done a lot of research, what advice would you give to people that are just starting out?
Oh gosh, the first thing I would do is tell them, talk to the oldest people in your family. Like, sit down, if your grandparents are still alive, sit down with them, like, get as much information as you can from them. And the information I got, your grandparents always want to talk to you. They always, they if they live there or whatever, they want to tell you those stories, but talk to the oldest people in your family, like, pick their brains, try to find out whatever you can find out. And like my mom, I ask her question all the time. Do you remember this person? You remember that person? But yeah, that's the to me, like, just ask the questions. Ask, what did you know about your grandparents? What did you know about? Tell me about the town you lived in, if they came from Italy, or like, that to me is the important thing. Ask those questions.
Yeah, and the great thing about people doing it now is we have the option of doing things like this, or you could record them on your camera and stuff like that.
Right.
Which is really, really neat. My cousin's son interviewed my uncle about his experiences in World War II and stuff like that, and taped it. And it's really good to have, things like that. But I tell everybody the exact same thing, ask grandma, that's the number one step.
Right. And I do try to remember some of, I of course I didn't ask the right questions. Back when I was 25 years old, I wasn't thinking about, looking up my relatives or whatever. Just didn't think about it. But I do remember a lot of the stories that I was told that they just, would tell, about, like, their parents, or, even, well, my great grandfather was still, I lived with him when I was a kid. So
yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that's really amazing.
Some of the stories he would tell. But that's the thing. That's what you have to do. Ask those questions. And that's the other thing, is when you're doing research, you have to ask the right questions. Like I said before, you can't just say, oh, I'm looking for, Raphael DeSimone. Well, like, they're going to come back and tell you there's 20 of them, And like you said, they're all born within 2 years of each other. Give as much information as you can. Do you know when they were born? Do you know where they were born? Do you know, did they have brothers or sisters, or, whatever information, you can find. A lot of times you're going to find information from other relatives just by asking. I had an interesting conversation. My mom had an 80th birthday party, a few months back, and her cousin, who I hadn't seen in probably like 30 years, he's a little bit older. And I sat and talked with him for the longest time. And he told me stuff about their grandparents that, a lot of stuff my mother didn't remember because she was younger. And he told me so much, about my mother's grandmother, who my mother didn't really know because she died when she was like a year old. So even talking to him, I learned so much in just a couple hours of talking.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, Tom, thanks a lot. I appreciate you being here. Great stories.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
great
for
advice for people starting out.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoy your podcast. I've heard some really good. You've had some really interesting people on, and I'll continue to listen.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it.